Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Carolyn, for putting this together, for getting me over to Nerd Night, and thank you, Simon, for that fun. Um, this idea of the fifth wall kind of ties into my presentation a little bit in that we are all part of the event that I'm going to be talking about. And that is how the biophysical infrastructure of our planet is a more important climate solution than technology. And so I will explain what I mean by biophysical and so on and so forth as we go. I just wanted to say I'm born in Austin, which is kind of a unique thing these days. And I have lived here most of my life. I have a nonprofit called Biointegrity that works on the kinds of things I'm sharing tonight. And I've been a part of the local and national music scene and environmental community for about 30 years. And then this photo is from our backyard in South Austin, and it represents some of this biophysical infrastructure I'm going to talk about. So the word biophysical, of course, the first piece of that is the bio part, the life. And so that includes not just biodiversity, but also behaviors and also productivity, which I'll get into quite a bit tonight. But just for a moment, consider here, as Amy says, consider here all the neighbors that we share on our planet, and take just a second and look at some of these kind of cute and fun little things happening. The kissing fish in the bottom left, and the lizard next to the mama orangutan who is grabbing a fly with his long tongue, and the happy spider and the bacteria. And all of these things living their happy lives is actually how we are able to live. Probably most of you all know that, but I'm going to try and break that down a little bit more. They, other species live in wildernesses, which are biophysical infrastructure. So the other part of this idea of biophysical is the physical part, the ecosystems. Ecosystems are predominantly made of living entities. And so the density of organisms in a space, the depth of those organisms, both horizontally and vertically, if it's a water column, vertically, if it's on land, we're talking about vegetation and trees and soils. And then the diversity of organisms, as well as the conditions of the climate, primarily the temperature in an annual sense and the moisture cycles in a given space. These are the things that determine how productive a physical infrastructure, a biophysical infrastructure is, or an ecosystem is. And I've been really, really curious for the past few years about the science on what is the history of our life support system? How long has life been on Earth and that kind of thing? And also from an architectural standpoint, how did we build, or how did this life support system build itself, this biospheric system build itself? And it's a pretty simple paradigm. You can see in this mapping or this graph that we had microbial life for about 3 billion years, or 4 billion years before macro life, but 3 billion years of simple microbial life, single-celled microbes on Earth, gradually covering the planet, getting into the air, getting below the ocean, into the sediment rock. Basically anywhere there's moisture, there is life. And it took nearly 4 billion years of micro life for macro life to emerge, macro life being plants and animals. After that, of course, the dinosaur era ended about 66 million years ago, and our current biosphere began taking shape about 65 million years ago. And we showed up pretty recently. And it goes somewhat without saying that our lives, our existence, all these things are predicated and built upon the infrastructure of all of these life forms that come before us. And then, of course, lastly, I should throw in that in the last 12,000 years, since about 10,000 BC, the climate warmed up to the point where we could start to harvest from a very productive biosphere enough to create settlements and create modern civilization over the last few hundred years. Now, this is what our biosphere, our life support system literally looks like today. The continents have moved around over the past 4.5 billion years quite a bit, and the planet has been in many different temperature states. But this is where we are now in the Goldilocks climate. And the way the infrastructure of the biosphere and its productivity work is what you're seeing here. This is photosynthesis on planet Earth, which is effectively what biological productivity really is. It's the net positive production of vegetation and the integration of all of those happy species that you saw in that early slide with the GIFs bouncing around. The happier those things are, the more integrated those things are into these wilderness biophysical infrastructures, the more functional, the more resilient, the more productive, generally speaking, the ecosystems are. You'll notice in this slide, it looks like the Earth is breathing. That's what you're seeing is respiration on an annual basis of plant life. So in the northern and southern hemispheres, you see the undulating colors, and in the center, at the equator, you see the green just basically stays on the lands year round, and it undulates on the lands in different ways. And there's a green line in the water that kind of traces the equator, the literal equator. And then you see green in the oceans at the north and the southern end of the map. But that undulating on our lands in the United States and Asia and Europe and so forth, that means that things are not productive part of the year. When the seasons change and things get frozen, life no longer grows. In the tropics, where it's warm and in many places wet year round, you have constant productivity. And the slide isn't advancing. There we go. Okay, so that system composed of organisms has certainly a value, and we live in a time where we are trying to put economic values on all kinds of things. What is the value of this container for our existence? There is no other one in the known universe. It's also the platform for our economy. It's also the only nurturer for life. And you know, I am wrapping up a paper here that I'll probably release next week called "The Value of Biosphere Earth." And in that paper, I just put together this simple formula to try and put some sense of value to the overall life support system. And I think that would be all of the economic activity for all time, known and unknown, all of the life that has lived, known and unknown, and all of the life experiences that have taken place, known and unknown. So this is like an unquantifiable thing. We can't quantify the value of life experiences. We certainly can't quantify things that are unknown. But our biosphere contains all of this, and none of it's possible without the biosphere. So this is a mapping of some of the impacts of protecting the most productive ecosystems on the planet. My nonprofit has a program for small businesses where we go and connect businesses to the least expensive projects to help protect old growth tropical rainforests and tropical forests. And so what this shows are some of the tangible values that are hard to put economic value on, but the tangibles that come from protecting the life support system of our planet. So far, this program has protected about 62,000 acres of tropical forests. Those contain at least 12.5 million trees, mature trees, and those trees are filtering over 1 billion gallons of fresh water per year. They're also making enough oxygen for roughly 500,000 people per year, and these are conservative estimates. If you go from that blue quadrant down to the red quadrant, you can see some of the climate value that the productivity of these systems, this photosynthesis of continuous plant life growth and so forth, is pulling in about 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. So if you were to try to take 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide off of the electricity grid with rooftop solar replacing electricity, and your rooftop solar costs around $20,000 per system, you would need around $450 million to get the same carbon removal that these forests do in a stacked way. Their functions are all stacked. It's a multifaceted tool and technology, you could say, these ecosystems. So not only are they filtering water, they're sucking in carbon, and they're made primarily of carbon. The trees themselves are about 50% carbon in ecosystems. And so these tropical forest trees are super mature, and they contain at least 16 million tons of carbon. If you were to put that into a metric for vehicle miles, that's over 100 billion vehicle miles worth of emissions that we're keeping in the ground in a productive state in these trees. The upper green there, you see the different aspects of species that this program is helping. We've, critically endangered and endangered microbial and macro species, as well as the people, the direct impacts on people. We've, through this program, participated in helping over 100 indigenous communities, at least 6 refugee communities, and doing that in a way that's not always just about protecting lands. It's often just also about putting community-based regenerative economic development into these places that's controlled by the natives on site. So there's so much to be said for protecting the life support system in this tangible sense. that just blows away kind of where we're thinking right now. And I would say, as a now globally connected people, that our number one priority, our number one shared priority, is this integrity of our life support system being at an optimal state, biosphere Earth functioning as well as it possibly can. Also, I just have to mention, there is no other place that we can live. There's no other planet we can survive on. So we may get to, Mars or somewhere else pretty soon, but you just absolutely cannot go outside on any other planet. And in this container of a biosphere that we live in now, if you consider its irreplaceability, I think it makes the experiences that you have, just simple things like hearing the leaves, the wind blow through the leaves, so much more profound. Our biosphere, unfortunately, is plagued right now with what I would call tons of extreme crises or wicked problems, because they're so complex. And the climate solution that's being proposed right now doesn't take these wicked problems into account. The climate plans are certainly coming along and pretty exciting now. We've got great stuff going on in government. We've got great stuff going on in business and investment for technology and emissions reductions. And the UN is really leading the charge on thinking more broadly about eliminating poverty and stopping climate change and finding a way to feed the world by 2050 that doesn't destroy the world. I think, though, that the urgency of the situation is much greater than even the UN has really acknowledged. And the World Economic Forum, which is part of the UN now, is also leading this charge. But we need to be even more urgent. We need to be more bold. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. But back to the idea of wicked problems. These are not climate change problems. So there's things that we're doing that are destroying environmental resources and biophysical ecosystems, such as cutting down trees and setting forests on fire and overfishing and putting pavement all over things. There's the results of that are not even from climate change yet, that's causing problems for indigenous peoples and poverty and hunger and so forth. There's where we're going to end up in the near future. We have to think about how we want to grow economically. We supposedly want to get to 10 billion humans, and we want to feed every one of them and have a certainly better quality of life across the planet for every human being than we do now. And yet we're running out of resources. And we have to think certainly about the sixth extinction in the near future and other related things. And this is not the complete list of what's on the worksheet behind you, this wicked problems idea. These are just some of the highlights, that then there's more things that we're doing to the environment. We're putting wastes and physical materials into the environment that also destroy the living creatures inside of it and ultimately break down that infrastructure. So what's missing from these climate plans that are on a good track but are absent when it comes to really having an awareness of how to turn things around, I think, is what you've already seen here, some of this biospheric history and this idea of the complete unit of the biosphere Earth. Also the urgency and the solutions, and I'll show you the solutions in a second, but the urgency in regards to our biosphere honestly could not be greater. There's a study that came out in May of last year, released by two physicists, that said, if we don't stop deforestation by the end of this decade, civilization has a less than 10% chance of continuing after about 2040 in the most optimistic scenario. And that is a direct quote from the study. That's just from deforestation, just one of the wicked problems there. And I got into all of this kind of what do we do now stuff about the global biosphere back in 2016 because of this study that showed that more than 70% of human beings are already threatened with the loss of what you would call life support services, that our ecosystems are doing things like filtering fresh water. More than half of the fresh water in the United States comes through a forest before it comes out of your faucet, for instance, or lose food supplies, or lose a livable climate, or lose soils, and so on and so forth. That roughly now nearly 3/4 of humanity is already in danger. And we've seen serious droughts in South Africa and all kinds of other problems. So the big idea here is that we are doing to our planet what happened when the last asteroid hit. We're destroying the vitality and the ecosystems. We're doing it with things like roads and other kinds of settlements and mining and all of these different ways that our economy is kind of wired right now based on an outdated paradigm. So on the left here, you see biological productivity. That's the same as that animated green map, but it's compressed into a single image to show the intensity over a single year, the concentration of the productivity. So red is good in this map on the left. That means extreme productivity. Yellow is also good. It means productive. Green is pretty good, and blue is somewhat productive. And if then if you look over to the right, you see that there's just a smattering of protected areas, and not very much of the productive ecosystems are protected. The gray areas show where humanity has already overpowered nature. And the yellow areas show what's left that hasn't been overpowered by humanity yet and is unprotected or uninhabited by humans at any great scale. So I should point out that the uninhabited areas, you probably recognize the Sahara there in the top of Africa, also the Gobi Desert above India, also the outback in Australia. So these are three places nobody really wants to live. And then the forests of Russia and Northern Europe that are frozen and tundra, and the forests of Canada that are frozen and tundra. None of these 5 locations are productive at any real scale that helps us. And that's not good. We need to protect the ability of the planet to be continuously productive. In the same way that you think about protecting your body's vital organs, these ecosystems do the majority of the work. The red ecosystems here and the ecosystems that are also in the what I would call the vital organ ecosystem category, that would be the northern and southern oceans that were so green a moment ago, and the coastlines around the planet. So in other words, tropical lands and then and oceans, and then all coastlines and the northern and southern oceans are where the most productivity happens. That's what you see again in that map with the red. Then immediately to the right of that, you see circulation of moisture on our planet on a monthly basis. And this is showing that there's this incredible thing that's been happening for hundreds of millions of years, where the equator collects the most moisture on the planet and circulates it the fastest, or not the fastest, at the greatest concentration. But the forests and the grasslands and all the life that has grown here over the past 600 million years, particularly on land, is heavily influential on how that moisture is collected and how it moves. And I'll show you more on that in just a second. Because of this extreme moisture circulation, because of the collection of life that has taken place over the eons, now there's more carbon stored in these vital organ ecosystems than the other land-based ecosystems and water-based ecosystems. And there's more biodiversity there as well. And maybe we can talk about that more another time. This machine, as it were, from the standpoint of a climate solution, it absorbs carbon at massive scale. And it really is best to think of ecosystems in an ideal state as a sponge. And so as moisture evaporates off of open waters, it moves in through the atmosphere. And if it falls from the sky on a forest, the forest will capture an enormous amount of it and circulate it around. It's called moisture recycling, for as long as possible. And ecosystems with less vegetation above ground can circulate less moisture because there's just less physical infrastructure, less material to hold on to the moisture. Same thing with soils. The deeper the soils, the better. This is back to that early graph showing that density and depth, both vertically, above ground and below ground, and in water columns, that's what determines how much moisture can stay in a system and then circulate in that system and maintain its productivity. The sponge is really the tool that we need to be thinking about implementing now, the restoration of the sponge. And these sponges in the tropics demonstrate all of the kind of optimal characteristics of ecosystems at their most productive. And tropical forests, when they're doing their sponge thing, they cool the air because as air moves across the continents, it's attracted, hot, dry air is attracted to cool, wet, heavy air. And so it pulls the dry air towards the moist air inside the forest moisture recycling loop. And as it goes there, then it cools it down. And what you get from that looks kind of like this. This is extreme moisture recycling. But more importantly, you get this cooling effect at the hottest part of the planet. And most of the cooling that is shown in this graph, this map, is from moisture movement and moisture's ability to cleanse heat out of the air. But it's also from the canopies here that take that heat and turn it into this productivity, this photosynthesis that is growing things and feeding things and making oxygen and all of the things that come from photosynthesis. The last thing I want to point out here is just that all of these stacked functions, the productivity, the stored carbon, the density of biodiversity, the moisture circulation, and those impacts on cooling don't just affect local and planetary biodiversity and the climate at the tropics, but also they affect the weather all over the planet. And there's this idea of teleconnections. That means a remote connection, that an event happening in one part of the Earth can influence the weather somewhere else. And very briefly, this study from 2015 shows that it just compiled all the deforestation, or yes, all the studies about deforestation looking at teleconnections. And it shows that if we continue to deforest the Amazon, it'll worsen the drought in California. And you can kind of visually see what's going on from there, that the Amazon influences moisture cycles all the way up to the top of Canada, the top of Europe, the top of Asia, down to China, into East Africa. That Africa's forests, if they're deforested, it can upset the moisture and rainfall regimes or rainfall cycles in the United States and in Asia and in Europe and so on with the forests of Southeast Asia. So what we're talking about, I may have garbled this a little bit, but what we're talking about is how the deforestation of this biophysical infrastructure has a direct impact on our weather, including the drought in California right now and in other places around the world. And then ergo, sort of logically, the potential to reverse some of those impacts through restoration. And these are all these moisture-based impacts that come from the biophysical infrastructure of the planet. These are all services that unfortunately the climate plans and the technology solution doesn't address. And when you include in this biophysical technology the benefits of protecting and restoring the biophysicality of planet Earth to maybe a modicum state similar to the mid-90s or the early 70s would be ideal, and we'd have to do a lot of integration with our built world. But what you get are all of these functions on the right. You know, the energy and technology solutions can get carbon out of the atmosphere in the future and maybe some of the carbon out of the atmosphere that's there now. But carbon storage is not really something that technology can deal with very well yet at scale, whereas here we have an entire biosphere that is asking us to rebuild it to save ourselves. And you know, technology can deal with enhanced water security and enhanced food security, but not at the integrated global scale as the biosphere can. And certainly technology is not taking on things like temperature and moisture recycling and fertility and speciation and things that are essential to maintaining the life support system of the planet. So that's one of the main ideas here, is that by taking on this biophysical solution, which involves biodiversity, which involves bioproductivity, we are affecting the most important solutions to the climate that technology cannot
replace and is not even trying to right now. And again, it's about this infrastructure. So I want to share with you what all of my research would show is the 5 most wicked climate solutions, meaning like, you know, a wicked problem is a complex problem, and we're trying to solve the complex problem of climate change with a single solution of reducing emissions. And we need a more sophisticated solution. We need a solution that is, in a sense, self-complexifying. And so that would be restoring ecosystems and restoring the functionality of the biosphere. The number one most important thing is to protect what's left. So if you look at the equatorial systems, this is back to the map we saw a moment ago, you can see that the Amazon is about 50% protected in South America. In the center of Africa, some of the Congo is still intact. All of this needs to be protected. And then you scoot over to Borneo, which is directly above Australia, and Papua New Guinea, which is just to the right of Australia. And we need to protect these places as well. This is about the continuation of life support services. And then we need to, oh, and I should say, so if we don't do this, we will be releasing, just in terms of tree stored carbon dioxide, that would come from deforestation and loss of these ecosystems, somewhere in the range of 90 years worth of 2020's emissions is stored just in the trees, in these vital organ ecosystems in the tropics. And there's certainly more in the coastlines and the oceans. The second big wicked solution here is to really rescue biodiversity by reconnecting it. We have to grow biodiversity corridors everywhere that they are needed as fast as we can. And they are, of course, primarily needed in these vital organ ecosystems first. But doing this is basically getting out of the way, fostering some regrowth and then stepping aside and protecting things so they can restore on their own. And it's been shown that natural regrowth of forests has some enormous potential to remove emissions worldwide, something like 2/3 of historical emissions. So natural regrowth is a really powerful tool for absorbing carbon, but it's the most important tool for restoring biodiversity and the integrity of the ecosystems themselves. The third wicked solution that can solve a bunch of problems all at once is to regrow the vital organ sponge where it's been most recently destroyed. And you can see on this map where that is in red. This particular study showed, just from October, showed that these areas are the least expensive solutions on the planet for protecting carbon and biodiversity. If we protect these areas, we protect something like 60 or 80% of the most threatened biodiversity on our planet right now. And we could reduce historical emissions since 1800 by about 50%. The total capacity for regrowth here is enormous. It's more than what we need to stay out of the 1.5 degrees or the 2 degrees Celsius. The question is, how fast will we move to enact this? A fourth solution is to transform the aspects of our economy that are degenerative. The idea being we have lived in a self-destructive economy just for too long, and we have to make these changes or we'll continue down a dead end. This is showing from Project Drawdown, their compilation in 2020 of a bunch of different regenerative agricultural or crop-based and regenerative meat-based techniques, and that it would cost somewhere in the range of $1 to $0.3 trillion to transition the global food system over to a regenerative agricultural system. Then you would earn back somewhere in the range of $8 trillion in profit, and you would save somewhere in the range of $7 trillion in avoided costs from not transitioning the system so that it would be protected from climate change and the impacts of extreme weather getting worse, especially drought. And as we move forward, food and waste are really the two most important things to attack, in addition to the conversations we're already having. This solution has potential capacity to absorb something like 1/4 of all historical emissions since industrialization. And then lastly, I won't spend much time on this, but this is the plan that the UN is putting forth, called the Global Deal for Nature. It's also being called 30 by 30. And the idea here really is to let biodiversity lead and to rebuild the integrity of the biosphere by protecting the biodiversity that's most threatened right now and most hot spot, the most key, what am I trying to say? The most concentrated in total diversity. That if you go for these hotspot biodiversity areas and key biodiversity areas and link them all together, you get this global scale solution that would cost roughly $1 trillion to implement. And then the regenerative food thing, again, is also about $1.3 trillion. So to simplify all this and put it into a wrap-up frame, what we're talking about for this more impactful climate solution and more urgent climate solution is protecting the life-producing resources on our planet and the productivity of all of those resources, and then regrowing the functionality of a restored biosphere, regrowing the sponge strategically, restoring the moisture circulation around the planet, regrowing the carbon sinks and securing these carbon sinks that are on land and in waters, and then transforming not only the vital organ ecosystems themselves back into an optimal state, but doing that by transforming the economic actors and industries that are doing the most harm. And again, food and crops or crop commodities are where we need to focus there first. All of these things put together should have the most beneficial impact on our weather and on global warming. And one last way to kind of sum this up is that we're talking about ultimately is a massive change. And this is actually the first presentation of this. So, it's not as grand as it will become probably, but this idea of a fifth industrial revolution. The fourth was about how the internet had become pervasive, and we can basically access services all over the place on the internet now. That's a pretty cool industrial revolution. But now we need to harmonize our life support system with our economy, and create, you know, an endless future, as it were, for all of the for all of the life that is here. And I just want to say, you know, how can you help? How can we help? How can I help do these things? The biggest thing you can do right now that's an action that will protect physicality, will protect biophysical infrastructure, is this particular project from a group called Rainforest Trust that my nonprofit has been working with for the past 5.5 or 6 years. And so you can use the link. I'll have a QR code in a moment at the very last slide. This project will help save monarch migration habitat in Mexico. And yes, it's just 52 cents per acre to protect. Each acre holds about 120 tons of carbon dioxide stored in the ecosystem, in the trees and the vegetation and the soils. But this is a giant project. This is a 1.4 million acre project that is bringing together a bunch of what are called key biodiversity areas. So you're helping protect some of the last pristine ecosystems in Mexico that are monarch migration habitat. Monarchs are under extreme stress right now. And you're helping to safeguard over 280 bird species, 130 mammal species, 45 amphibian species, 142 reptile species, and over 4,000 plant species by helping this project. It has a matching donation, a one-to-one donation. So you actually are getting a 26 cent per acre value. $10 donation protects 38.4 acres. Okay, so this is the end. My project is called Biointegrity. It's been really a research project with an advocacy component so far, and now we're shifting into a nonprofit posture. And this is the message that we're going to try and craft and take forward. And you guys are the first ones to see it. These ideas. There's a lot more here. There's not many details in this presentation, but hopefully this gives you a sense of how powerful we can be in regards to the most logical response to the climate problem that will address this very near-term crisis that we have, where we have, according to the science, we have less than 20 years to keep our economy from destroying our life support system. And so by addressing that problem through protecting and restoring the physical infrastructure of the biosphere, we can engage the most powerful and beneficial climate solution. And thank you very much. I hope that was close to 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was an excellent follow-on to Simon's excellent talk. So let's go to the questions. So I think that there were a couple of people asking this in different ways. You know, you gave us some action items that we could do, but as far as, you know, trying to support the ultimate goal that you would suggest, what do you think the biggest one thing one person can do or change that would have the greatest positive impact to our environment?
Literally the biggest thing is to support that project in Mexico right now. Like a $15 donation with the donation match would offset your carbon footprint for life. It would protect that much carbon and help protect these species. There are plenty of other tropical forest projects out there, but they range, you know, from a few dollars per acre to thousands and tens of thousands of dollars per acre. So the first and most important thing to do is to get involved with protecting old growth tropical rainforests, and then just fan out from there, protecting these vital organ ecosystems.
Okay, great. And what can someone do to advocate for the policies that are kind of rolled up into this? If there's something that resonates with them, how do you get your voice heard if you support, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about?
Well, policy-wise, there's certainly not much happening yet in this idea of what I would call a biospheric reformation, that we need to really allow policy and economics to be guided by this
shared value of having an optimal life support system. But in terms of those wicked solutions, the 5 things that I showed that I think are the top 5 things that we should be focusing on right now in terms of the climate solution. Protecting forests is really not much of a Texas issue, not much of a federal issue. So you could get involved with working in California. So California's got some tropical forest legislation for carbon offset markets that they're developing. You could try and support that work. For regenerative food, there will be, I'm sure, in the Biden plan quite a bit for making use of better soil techniques and maybe a lot more reforestation around forests. The idea of intercropping with forests to keep the moisture cycles secure. There are certainly, on a related tangent to that, there's things happening around genetically modified organisms and fertilizers that are made from fossil fuels, and the IP ownership of crops, and any policies that are about trying to keep those things from progressing are better for the biosphere as a general rule than the things that give more private market control to interests that are not concerned about the biosphere. In terms of, let's see, one other from that collection, in terms of this really important one of regrowing the sponge in the vital organ ecosystems area, I don't know of anything policy-wise that's pushing on that. And that's actually part of the reason for this nonprofit, is that there is so much that needs to be done right now in relationship to the biodiversity crisis. And in taking action on the biodiversity crisis, we can win so much bigger on the climate crisis. And yet we have almost no awareness of the fact that there is biodiversity at cultural level right now. So I don't know of policy off the top of my head for those things, but I think local action maybe to protect biodiversity is important. Again, the last thing I'll say is like the globally strategic aspect of this is the most important aspect. That's why I kept that little productivity slide up for so long. Is that even if we improve the green belt in Austin and bring back, you know, the salamanders at Barton Springs, that doesn't get us the kind of scale of solution that we need to stop the climate problem and the extinction problem and the other things related to that. So
okay,
you can stay local, but it's better to aim and work at the global level.
Okay, noted. So that kind of ties into the next question in some ways, I think. Can you talk a little more about how land rights protection works for refugees and indigenous people? That was one of the things in the 4-color grid you showed.
Yeah, so the ideal conservation model is to empower the traditional peoples that have been living on a landscape or on a coastal scape for, you know, hundreds to thousands of years, aka the indigenous people to that place. The reason those places are still there is always because the culture of those communities doesn't even imagine destroying the ecosystem and replacing it with a, you know, a parking lot or a hotel or something like that. So the way it works is the ideal system is to put the property into a federally protected system similar to Yellowstone here in the United States, and then to give the permanent land occupation rights to the indigenous people on that site. The other next best model is to give land ownership to the indigenous people and to back that up with a conservation organization. But the reason that the conservation groups prefer to put things into federal ownership like we have in the United States National Park System is just because the federal system is so much more, you know, resourced at protecting these things. And then you can integrate the governmental support for the indigenous people on site from the municipal all the way to the federal scale. When it comes to the refugees, these are people that basically have been forced onto these indigenous lands. So like we helped a project in Cameroon that had something like a dozen different refugee nationalities on it. We've helped projects in Nepal that had a dozen or more refugee nationalities on it, and the same thing in Indonesia. in that case, those people are basically being supported. You know, they're already there. They're not there to destroy the place. They're there to try to survive and make a life. And so that's when you bring in these community-based development and regenerative economic tools to try and set up better quality of life, better securities for these folks so they can begin to make some money in a way that actually maintains the stewardship of the system. And that can be applied to the indigenous communities as well. So like in super short overview, it's to ideally put the lands into the national park system in a given country if that country's government is strong enough to do that well, and if not, to put the lands either into the ownership of the indigenous people there or a conservation group that can that is designed to protect those indigenous people and to protect those lands in perpetuity. And the refugees are included in that ethos.
Okay, thank you. So there's one last question, and it's you know, it's a top level overview question, and do the best you can in like 3 minutes. How does your solution to climate change address the main reason for climate change, capitalism? And do you think green capitalism is viable for all?
No, I don't think we have really, this is part of the reason I shared some of that harsh stuff. I don't think we've really grasped how significantly we need to change things. I don't know that capitalism is the thing to put the blame on, though. I sort of have been, you know, and unfortunately my research is mostly through watching The Crown and kind of thinking things through, but I've been studying a little bit and reading or thinking a lot about what's behind capitalism is the colonialism, and what's behind colonialism is this wealth hierarchy system that built, you know, the modern economy. So you think of someone like the Queen of England, who is just enormously wealthy and as you watch that show go on, you know, people suffer like crazy all the time, and the Queen is sequestered in one of her many palaces and stuff. That system of the strong man who could build a community, and then kind of you built the government, the strong man built the government, and the strong man got to keep the money, got to keep the riches. That system got us to capitalism, and it got us to the 20th century, and it got us to the 21st century. But now we're in a situation where, as Simon sort of pointed out, you know, the justice issues around that are really needing attention. Making amends for all the injustice that's already occurred needs attention. But most importantly, this concept of domination and hierarchy as the fundamental construction tool on which we build an economy, that has to change. We have to think in these regenerative terms. We have to think in these biospheric terms. And I think what we do now before green capitalism is finance the solution by calling on global wealth, calling on the private sector to now step up to the plate and save itself.
All right. Light thoughts for a Wednesday night.
Quick question. When you use the phrase, when you use the phrase, "we are the asteroid" in your talk, were you aware that this phrase is an eco-fascist dog whistle? Did you know that this phrase is used to dehumanize the humans who have the least access to birth control?
No, and that's not why I was using it. I was referencing the dinosaur extinction event.
So you were comparing humans as a whole to the cause for the extinction event. That's exactly what I was talking about. It's a dog fascist. It's a fascist dog whistle because it ignores completely everything that like native populations that were able to live in harmony with the world before capitalism came around, and it ignores.
Maybe what you read has ignored it. I mean, I think I showed pretty well what I was referring to, which is the loss of ecological continuity, and then I can talk at length about indigenous people. I just didn't have time to put that into this slide, but I think the model of stewardship begins with understanding indigenous peoples. And so when I say we are the asteroid, I'm referring to really the economic development primarily that's taken place since World War II. So like after World War II, there were less than 3 billion people on Earth. Now we're at close to 8 billion people, and it hasn't even been, 80 years yet. So we are the asteroid is a reference to the type of economic development where we are expanding horizontally and consuming resources faster than they can replenish. But it's not a reference to indigenous people in any way, shape, or form. They would be the example to look to for how best to understand what's going on inside of these ecosystems. And then we have to harmonize with the reality of maintaining this productivity. So the communities that live in harmony are typically...
I'm done, but it worked exactly like...
I'm not sure what happened there.
Yeah, me either.
I think there was a lot of interesting content that was discussed. I'm not sure where.
Yeah, where you want to go with that, Simon? I wouldn't call myself an eco-fascist, but realist.
So with that being said, it sounds like there are a lot of different lenses that can be applied to this. And I think that complex issues often require complex conversations. So it is good to be willing to engage. And that is kind of where I'm at as a host in this particular scenario. But I would like to thank you both for being here tonight. And at this point, wanted to kind of go just kind of back to more of a housekeeping thing and mention that we'll be doing this again next month. See how that goes. And I do thank you both for your time. I do thank you both for your expertise. And I would encourage anybody who watches this either live or who watches it later to contact the speakers if they have things that they want to discuss in some more detail. So there is that. All right then.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jacob.